So John, thanks, Jason. John, if you want to push, so we are recording, that's great. Just some administrivia. This is Paul Asadorian from Security Weekly. Thanks everyone for attending our webcast today. Both the slides and the recording will be made available to everyone after the broadcast. And we always get a lot of questions about that, so certainly you'll have access to these materials after the broadcast. I'm really excited about today as it's interesting. Those of us on the Security Weekly show have very strong opinions about threat intelligence. We found a vendor in the threat intelligence space who largely shares our thoughts and opinions and have been working with them throughout the year to produce content to educate our audience on threat intelligence. So John is going to lead the discussion today. Jason Cohen, who introduced himself just a moment ago, is here representing Threat Connect. And I'm really excited to see the both of you, what the conversation turns into, and some of the examples that we can give our audience on how threat intelligence can go wrong. John, just one note. I think because I'm a co-organizer, I can't see people's questions. I don't know if we can change that before we get started, but I'm not able to see the Q&A panel. So hopefully we'll get that fixed, and I will be monitoring people's questions. And now I will turn it over to John Strand and Jason Cohen. John, you there? John is likely furious.
Yes, I
Oh,
am.
there he is.
I'm there. There we go. Just furiously trying to find the unmute button. So at the end of this presentation, I'm going to talk about how we got set up with Threat Connect, because it's kind of an interesting story. And you know, we got to know the Threat Connect people and kind of what they're doing and how it's fundamentally different than a threat intelligence feed. And that's why we took them on as a vendor.
And John,
awesome.
Jason has a short demo, a 10-minute demo at the end, so you get to see the product at the end as well, which is good.
Perfect.
So stick around for that.
Awesome sauce. All right, so let's talk about how it should work. If everything worked wonderfully and you went out and you bought a threat intelligence feed, you would just simply pull down this whole list of IOCs, signatures, blacklists, TTPs of attacks that hit other organizations, and then you'd hunt and block those, and it would be simple, and life would be very, 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 very easy for all of us, right? If it sounds like it's a glorified blacklist technology slash hope slash dream slash nether iteration of antivirus blacklisting approaches, it is. And really what we keep on buying into in this industry is trying to find a blacklist of known bad and then trying to simply find known bad and then trying to block known bad. And that known bad approach is not going to work, at least for a targeted determined attacker. It may work for different variants of CryptoLocker. It may work for different variants of malware that actually hits organizations and some lower end attackers. But whenever you have like a nation state level attacker or a higher end attacker coming at your organization targeted, it doesn't always match up cleanly, right? It's just really kind of looking like a lot of threat intelligence feeds are just bigger and more complex. And also it's really like trying to view security in reverse. You're looking at attacks that happened in the past 24, 48 hours, 32 hours, whatever, and then you're trying to detect those attacks in your organization. And we're missing some fundamental cores. So I'm going to walk through some of the key mistakes that I see organizations that try to implement threat intelligence in their organization make consistently, again and again and again. And that's one of the main reasons why a lot of threat intelligence implementations tend to fail. Especially in the first year or two that they're implemented, because we need to avoid those pitfalls. I've had a number of people, Paul, as you know, Ben Jackson has very, very strong opinions on threat intelligence. I've talked to some people on the security team at Facebook, and they have very strong opinions on threat intelligence. And these are organizations that tend to do things right. And I'm also going to talk about what we're seeing organizations do right in this space and how they actually implement it properly. So experience in the field that we've been seeing, lots of customers. Paul is also a member of IONS. He's IONS faculty. And we do a lot of calls. I haven't done many calls in the past month with IONS. But Paul, I mean, on average, we probably do about 10, 15 calls with customers a month.
Yeah, I would say between the two of us, that's accurate on a wide variety of topics too.
Tons. But this is one that is constantly coming up to the top.
Comes up a lot.
Right?
Yep.
Comes up constantly. And one of the things we keep asking our customers and the people that join these calls, how many of you are happy with what you're getting from your threat intelligence feed? And it's probably less than 1%. talking to people over the course of an entire year, I can think of maybe a handful of customers that are like, yes, we love threat intelligence, is providing actionable intelligence in what we do, and it's just fantastic. Also, it very rarely, and this is something that's interesting, we'll talk more about Threat Connect a little bit later, but it's very rare for any of these products to actually cleanly integrate with your existing security platforms, whether it's your SIEM, your IDS, your IPS, your firewalls, user behavioral analytics, whatever it actually is. There's very little that is actually tying this stuff together. Sure, they'll submit Blacklists to update firewall rules, but to actually integrate data from NetFlow, to integrate data from your SIEM and then correlate that back to actual threat intelligence feeds to try to find some semblance of behavior matching is pretty rare. We don't see that in a lot of organizations, and to be quite honest, we don't see that very much at all in a lot of products. There's a tremendous amount of interest. Like I said, tons of IANS calls on this, and lots of questions post-penetration test. After we've broken into an organization, Paul, it's one of the big questions we get every time, is how come we didn't detect this? How come we didn't see this? And this isn't just an issue for threat intelligence feeds per se, but it's just kind of an overarching question of whenever you have a targeted attacker coming at your organization, how come you are not able to detect it? And that's a scary question to ask yourself in the middle of the night. You hire a pen test firm, a good pen test firm, and they get in, and you're like, well, how come my AV didn't catch it? How come my IDS didn't catch it? How come my IPS didn't catch it? How come my data loss prevention didn't start to detect it? And you start to get a sinking feeling that a lot of the security technologies that you're buying maybe aren't working, and that's been borne out again and again and again. So the first mistake, and this is one of those things that Jason, Paul, and I were talking about at the beginning of this webcast, is a lot of people look at threat intelligence feeds as a club, right? They get this information, they get these stories, they get these narratives of these different attacks, and they get these heads up, and you talk to them and they'll kind of pull you aside, they'll look back behind themselves and be like, hey, I got a hot tip that attacker X, it can be attackers in Russia, it can be attackers in China, it can be attackers anywhere. They're using this specific vulnerability against Flash to exploit networks. And there's something about that, right? Like you're finally part of a group, you're part of a club, and it's exclusive. You're getting exclusive information that nobody else has access to, and maybe you have to pay a lot of money for that information, or maybe it's kind of a threat intelligence group that you stood up within your specific industry, but it becomes this herd mentality. And very rarely do I see people step back and say, but is this attack actually in your network? Is it networks like yours? Is there some type of configuration consistency that you're seeing? And this is, once again, gets back, I'll talk about the data to information to knowledge to wisdom paradigm a little bit later. What we're getting here is we're getting a lot of data. Data without meaning, data without being tied into impact within our organization themselves. And oftentimes when you get this information, like I said, it's old, and does it actually correlate cleanly to future attacks that you're actually seeing? And far often, threat intelligence feels like it's just that sense of exclusivity. You're paying a lot of money for this specific club, and you're part of that club. And to be sure, Paul and I see that a lot in our calls. I see it a lot at SANS conferences. But when you start asking people hard questions, like is your threat intelligence feed actually impacting and changing your security architecture and your security approach? And the answer then is like, well, no, not recently, but we did get a lot of really cool stories out of it. And I don't think that there's a lot of value in that. So that would be probably mistake number one, is thinking that if you're purchasing this threat intelligence feed, that you're part of some type of exclusive club and you're getting information that no one else has on the internet about specific types of attacks. And that becomes a big trap of a lot of threat intelligence feeds vendors, is they're basically just their own feed. They're not really something that is tying together multiple feeds, multiple data sets, normalizing them all down, and then trying to find trends across multiples. And that seems to be something that is missing. Mistake number two, not knowing yourself. Now, Jason, you've worked in a lot of organizations over the past few years. You said past 7 years working in security itself. How many organizations have you come across, I would say, let's say in the past 7 years, they're like, they get it. They got this stuff all tied together. They're doing it right. They know how their network actually is approached. They know their architecture. They know their implementation. Do you see that very often?
In the private sector?
Yeah.
Not many. And I think it's kind of just almost a commonality of the reality of how organizations are attacked, how threats are constantly evolving, which is why this industry is thriving, and you hear about it in the news all the time.
Yeah.
But the basically what I've seen over the last 7 years, working in various different organizations of various different calibers and dare I say budgets, because I've seen organizations that they'll slap a band-aid on something, and then I'll see organizations that'll spend a gajillion dollars by every tool that's out there, and now they have an IR team that has 50 tools that they're expected to work with on any given day, which of course doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I've pretty much run across the gamut as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, and it's like, Paul and I were talking, it's very rare to find those magical white unicorns that actually do get it. And, I think it's interesting that you brought up budget. For me personally, for the really good security teams, there really seems to be very little in correlation between budget and actual skill in security teams. And I think that that's sometimes interesting as well. I mean, you have to have some budget, of course, right? You just can't be, the janitor in the back, like mop closet doing computer security. You have to have some budget, but I see organizations that have hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars in budget, and they really aren't getting security. And I see teams that have much smaller budgets, much smaller teams that just absolutely rock it. But I think that one of the key themes that we see again and again for organizations that are doing it right is the basics, right? Do you know your systems? This is something Paul talks about constantly with vulnerability management. And the heart of vulnerability management is truly understanding your systems, understanding your vulnerabilities, understanding what you have in your organization, not just from a vulnerability perspective, but also extending that and understanding workstations, servers, your network architecture, what are your IP ranges, and truly understanding that, your traffic, your applications. And then, some basic questions. Do you have a span or a mirror port for egress traffic so somebody can plug in? Do you have something like a Gigamon that you can basically pull off a feed? Are you running Bro? What are you running that actually gives you that visibility on what's leaving your environment? And, kind of the last question that I think is interesting, if I were to give you an IOC for your organization, give you a full readout of IOC in whatever format I want to give it to you in, would you actually be able to query your systems to be able to ask, are there any systems that are exhibiting those behaviors right now? Could you do it with WMIC? Could you do it with PowerShell? Are you using something like Tanium? Are you using something like Carbon Black? Are you using, what is it, Red Squirrel or, Red Canary, sorry. Are you using any of these products to be able to give you that type of visibility into your systems to ask those questions? And by and large, most organizations, before they jump into a threat intelligence feed situation, they really should have a basic understanding of what their own network actually is. So let's see, do we have any questions? We do have a quick comment from Brian. He's talking about, he's actually talking about your product, Jason. He says that it's got pretty good integration with Splunk. They have lots and lots of good bells and whistles, which I think is pretty good. Is a good statement. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, just type them in.
Yep, that just went live. We also have a great ArcSight integration as well.
Very cool. Which is actually horrifying. What did you do for your developers that actually developed the ArcSight integration? Did you like buy them a pony when they were done as a congratulations? Because most people that try to integrate with ArcSight don't do very well for very long. It's kind of like that movie, what was it, Event Horizon, where people were carving out their eyes and they say they don't need eyes to see. That's usually how I see ArcSight integration teams go.
Well, it was definitely a walk up the hill, but we didn't buy the developers a pony. We bought them a unicorn, and it's worked pretty well so far. And actually, it's one of the things in the last year that I was able to participate in, not on the developer side, but on threat intel side, that was really exciting.
Cool. All right, let's get away from Barbie for a second. Fear everything. Paralysis. Whenever you start getting these feeds, it can become horrifying because you start getting a clear indication of the types of attacks that are hitting organizations, maybe organizations like yours. And you're seeing the advanced attacks. Like Jason, you've talked about kind of the evolution of attacks and attack skills and their TTPs and their malware and how they're constantly evading and getting around a bunch of security products. And I don't think that the news media does as good a job kind of, explaining just how bad the situation is. And I just as an example, I've been talking about this in a number of presentations that I've given over the past couple of weeks. It blows my mind that people are looking at the attacks that hit like John Podesta or the Democratic National Committee, and they keep saying, like, the only people that could have pulled this attack off, the only people that could have done it were the Russians. They're the only people with the skills to pull this off. And if you dig, you actually start finding out that what it was just a simple spear phishing email. It was basically an email and a link, and it said, hey, change your Gmail password. And Podesta went so far as to forward it on to a tech and say, hey, is this legit? Should I click this link? And one of their techs said, yeah, that's totally legit. Reset your password. You want to do that. Security is important. And that's what got him compromised. That's not elite level attacker stuff. That's basically, day one script kiddie social engineering usage, social engineering toolkit usage by Dave Kennedy and the folks at TrustedSec. So, but once you kind of get past that veneer of that kind of general news, and you actually start getting into the meat about, there's a new Java 0 day, or there's a new Flash 0 day, there's a new exploit kit, and then you start getting terrified. You finally start seeing just how bad it can be. But this can be good too. Jason, how many times do you see people that actually get that type of visibility, and then all of a sudden they have motivation to start doing better? They realize that they maybe didn't have the security architecture in place that they should have had in place, but they finally have that visibility, and they now know the types of threats that they're going up against.
Well, to answer your question, I would say that it's not that common. I think it's getting better. It's getting better every year. But to also address the point that you made before that, as far as, it turns out the John Podesta compromise was literally kind of just a boneheaded situation. I mean, Threat Connect, actually, the research team, we did a series on the compromises of the DNC and the DCCC, which we all saw how the media played out over the summer. And it turns out that the way they were compromised was literally, it was a domain freaking instance. Somebody registered a domain that was visually kind of weird, that a staffer ended up falling for, and then they got compromised. So
Yeah.
there's a whole wide range of threats out there. And I think it is really a combination between the sophistication of an organization's security team, the education and training of the general employees, and then the always evolving TTPs of the threat actors. It's just this dance that just constantly keeps going.
Now, here's an interesting question from James. He said, is it true that the goal of threat intelligence is attack attribution? That's interesting. I've got my theory, but Jason, I'm going to let you go first. Why don't you take that one? Is the goal to get attack attribution when we're talking about threat intelligence?
Well, that's an interesting question. But first, what I'd say is attribution is always been the kind of muddy water in this business. It's not very easy to attribute attacks to a threat actor. Even if you have a lot of what you think is good data, or data that's not been spoofed or compromised or just straight up faked. But that begs the question then, is that are we more concerned about having our assets compromised, whether that means like our data, our personally identifiable information, our proprietary information, and our money? Are we more interested in losing that and having that compromised, or are we more worried about pointing the finger so that some retaliation can happen?
Yeah.
That's kind of my opinion on that question.
And that kind of goes back to that kind of mistake number one of being at a club, right? You got people like, yeah, this attack is being launched by PLA group 762-B. The guy's name was Ping. He was the guy that was launched in the attack, and I believe that day his hair was purple. I mean, it doesn't really improve the security of your organization in many situations, even if you get attribution, right? So I think that's a very interesting question, and that also ties into what Paul and I are dealing with. We think that attribution is somewhat important, especially whenever you're talking about kind of trying to build your defenses in such a way to build it for the right attacker. If you know that you're getting attacked by somebody who's in Russia, hypothetically, or China, or from the NSA, whoever it actually is, then it'll actually help you communicate with management and say, hey, we need budget. We're not going up against a bunch of script kiddies in their grandmother's basement. We're actually going up against some very determined, targeted, skilled, and well-funded attackers. That's going to fundamentally change the way that your budget outlook looks, and it's going to change the way that your architecture looks. So I think that attribution is important, but it's not the end all be all, and I think that's point very well made, Jason. Mistake number 5, apparently I skipped over 4, is to do nothing. to do absolutely nothing. And this is a story I like to tell. There's one of my favorite books. It's a Russian book, Scenes from the Bathhouse, Mikhail Zhashenko. And in it, there's this apartment complex in communist Russia back in the 80s, and they're going to get power for the first time, right? They're going to get electricity, and they're going to have lights, they're going to have outlets, they're going to be able to have appliances, and oh my gosh, everybody in this apartment complex is all super duper excited about getting lights and getting electricity to the apartment complex. And they talk throughout this entire this one particular story in this book. All these people are glorifying Russia. Oh, it's so great to be living in Russia because we get this. They don't have that in America, even though this was like in the 70s and the 80s, right? And then finally, whenever this old lady gets her power and she's got her light bulb in her apartment, she goes and she flips the switch and sees just how dirty her apartment actually is. Her home is just filthy. And she's never seen it before because it's always been dark, right? It's always been completely dark. She's never been able to see it because that light has never been completely on, and cockroaches are scurrying all over the place, and there's big piles of dust, and it's just grimy. And she grabs the light and just kind of rips it out and throws it out in the hallway and never puts it back in. And I think that that's very kind of representative of what we see in security. A lot of people, if they actually put in proper security controls, a lot of times there's so much to do that they just kind of want to ignore it. We talk about this a lot in vulnerability management. Some organizations, whenever you enable full credentialed scans of an organization, and they finally have that full visibility of just how bad their vulnerability profile is, many times they're like, there's nothing we can do. We're just never going to look at that ever again. And I think that that's one of the main risks too of buying threat intelligence feeds, because you become overwhelmed, right? And you just basically say, trying is the first step for failure. And it's unfortunate that a lot of organizations feel this way whenever they become overwhelmed. And many times that kind of breeds there's a certain level of ignorance that breeds this fear as well. Mistake number six.
I like your story, John, and I think it begs the question. We used to phrase it as, "How tall do you need to be to ride the ride?" Or how do you know when you're ready? And I think that for a lot of us, your analogy is great, because most of us know that you have to dust and clean, and we have a procedure for that, and we know what needs to be done to fix a lot of the problems. However, if we're not doing that and we're relying on darkness to essentially cover our messiness, then we're in a lot of trouble. And I think a lot of organizations are in that particular state today, where they're searching for solutions such as threat intelligence or any other security solution. And then when you get down and you ask them questions about some of the foundational elements of security and if they exist in their environment, and they say, no, we're not doing all of that. And I think that's one of the huge problems that we have in security today.
Kind of sticking on that overwhelm approach is, a lot of people, whenever they turn this on, they expect everything to be an exact match. And talking about the Verizon data breach reports and the Mandiant Mirror reports and all these things, like over 90% of the targeted breaches that happened in organizations, the bad guys used custom malware. It may have been a slight variation on malware, but it wasn't the exact same malware being used again and again and again per se. And I think it also ties back into a mistake number two is, or not even a mistake, but mistake zero, right? We expect this to work like antivirus. We're going to turn it on, and it's magically going to tell us absolutely everything that's bad in our environment. We just go find all the IOCs, and we can clear them out, and we just find that exact match. And I've even had some customers, Paul, that are like, oh, well, the process mutex isn't the exact same, so it's not the same malware. Like, but did it drop the same dynamic link libraries? Yeah, it dropped, 4 out of the 5, but it wasn't a perfect match, so it was a false positive. It's like, no. Even if it's close, there's horseshoes, hand grenades, and IOCs. If you can get close, then you really need to start doing some type of investigation. So we're looking for that exact match, or we become completely overwhelmed. And this becomes one of the problems that we see in companies that are implementing things like Carbon Black, is there's so much information coming. There's so many, I don't want to say false positives because that has so many negative connotations with it, but there's so many alerts that are being generated that it becomes an overwhelming, daunting task to actually work through all of those different alerts that we would expect to get out of something like an IOC from a threat intelligence feed. But there are organizations that are doing it right. And Paul, I was trying to find perfect match, and I saw that this really ridiculous prom picture of this couple, and I was like, wow, they put way too much time into their prom picture, but I think it worked out well.
They're doing it right. I would agree with that. I
Yeah,
like it.
you're doing it right. It's a little crazy, but hey, it's pretty awesome. But there are customers that rock at this. There's a bunch of companies that we've been talking to over the past, I would say, 4 or 5 months that are doing threat intelligence. They're implementing threat intelligence feeds. They're working forward, but they're doing things right. And what are they doing? Well, what we're seeing is they're tying their feeds together into what they're seeing in their environment. It's not just this big blacklist that's coming through. They're actually tying it with what they see on the ground, tying it into their SIM, tying it into the IDS IPS, tying it into spam filtering, coordinating multiple feeds and multiple different formats. I'm going to talk about some open source things and some different references that you guys can look at, but there's a big problem in the threat intelligence community right now, and the fact that many of the threat intelligence feed providers can't agree on a set of formats. They just can't be like, well, we're going to have our format feeds always be done this way. They got to come up with their new feeds all the time. It's like WS Federation versus SAML. It's like all the different logging formats that are out there. You would think that logging time and logging, what actually occurred, what user ID would be a very simple format on how to do that, but everybody wants to do it different. And trying to coordinate that across all these different types of feeds is an absolute freaking nightmare. So let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and fuzzy logic. As Paul and I progress in the webcasts for threat intelligence and hunt teaming, we really want to pull back the veil associated with what artificial intelligence actually is doing, okay, and how it actually works. So by and large, what happens with a lot of artificial intelligence algorithms is you define something perfect, right? We'll talk about this in beacons, we'll talk about it here for threat intelligence feeds, but you define something that is perfect, a perfect IOC. For malware, you got the hash, you got the dynamic link libraries, you got the process mutex, you got the different APIs that it hooks into, you got the network communications that it pulls across. It's perfect, it's beautiful. But whenever you're dealing with artificial intelligence, let's just deal with regular human-based intelligence. One of the things that human beings are very good at is pattern matching. And by being good at pattern matching, it means that you need to be able to identify when a pattern isn't perfect, but it's close. Like we talk about Plato's concept of the chair. What is the perfect chair? Well, it may not matter all that much, right? If you move on to Aristotle and other philosophers, but it doesn't really matter. From a human being, we can look at a wide variety of chairs and be able to identify that they are all, in fact, chairs. Whereas if you're working with a computer and it's trying to do that perfect pattern matching, there's some ways that you can try to do this. You could try to feed every possible image of a chair to a computer, and then the computer will try to find the perfect matches, and its failure rate is going to be off the charts because it's never going to be perfect, right? Or you can actually use artificial intelligence, which is using some level of fuzzy logic. You can use k-means and k-clustering. So what you do is you define a perfect IOC, and then you can basically identify how far off an actual kind of collect from the inside of your environment is from that perfect indicator of a compromise. Like you may have a hit on 7 out of 10 aspects or traits of an IOC. You may only have 6, but that'll give you some level of actually doing some kind of prioritization within your organization. And this is where it gets tough, because when people are doing these queries and they're trying to do it on their own, they'll write queries and they'll write it out saying these are all the characteristics, and that can take a long time to write that query to a database. And then you start pulling off the different characteristics. And when you start getting to like 10 characteristics of an IOC, when you're looking at dynamic link libraries, you're looking at hashes, you're looking at network connections, you're looking at process mutex, you're looking at all these things that you can use to define malware. It's really difficult to start pulling those Jenga blocks off one at a time without the entire thing collapsing, or doing a full complete analysis of it. And that's where artificial intelligence can come in very powerfully. It can actually look at collect from a number of systems. It can compare it to an IOC, and it can say, this is close. So it turns out that in computer logic, getting perfect is easy for trying to find a match, but getting close and trying to fuzz it out is incredibly, incredibly difficult. So you're looking for clusters and patterns. So here I've got a k-means that I stole off the Wikipedia. Dealing with Old Faithful, and it's looking at the waiting times versus eruption time associated with Old Faithful, like how long you have to wait and how long the eruption actually is. And the correlation that you start to see is a very tight correlation at, I would say, 2 minutes and for eruption time and 50 minutes waiting, and then you have another cluster center at like 4.75 and 80 minutes, right? So you can actually find those patterns in that clustering. So for computers, you can actually do that type of analysis across your entire environment, and you can find clusters of possible IOC matches within your organization using this type of artificial intelligence. And later on, we're actually going to go through, and not this webcast, but later webcasts, we're actually going to pull up the math and the formulas, and we're going to show you how this type of analysis is being done. And it turns out it's not all that difficult. It's not rocket science. Rocket science is rocket science. But it is something that's important for us to understand as we move forward, and people are talking about artificial intelligence, and they're talking about machine learning algorithms. Actually knowing what they do is key for us as security representatives, because finding those edge cases is important, because then we'll know the limitations of our tools. And realistically, this is something Paul and I have been talking about a lot for the past 6 months, ever since he called me at like 7, 8 o'clock at night while I'm eating dinner with my family, and he's talking about chess. Artificial intelligence coupled with a good chess player is damn near unbeatable. Artificial intelligence by itself is very, very hard to implement to where it wins. And people can point to like Deep Blue and Watson and all those things. Yeah, but those are massive supercomputers beating the best chess player at chess, not even all the time. So we're trying to find ways that we can couple these artificial intelligence algorithms with a human component to make it so it's better for us to do data analysis. So some quick wins that you can implement. What are some small threat intelligence things you can do right now? First, you can get your house in order. And yeah, I know this is the same thing as active defense. I realized, Paul, as I was going through a lot of my problems with threat intelligence, people not knowing their own house, people not having good security in place to begin with, that a lot of those same arguments could be applied to active defense. And I think that I maybe didn't give threat intelligence itself as much of a shake as I should have, because we've been pushing active defense, which is another type of advanced security implementation that organizations should be looking at as well. But we're going to cover some small tactical things you can throw in right now to help build support for a full threat intel platform. Some products that are out there that are awesome. Open Canary is a product Chris Gates recommended to me. He's doing some really, really cool stuff at the company that he's at right now, and they're using Open Canary. They're creating a bunch of different honeypots. They're spreading those honeypots all over the inside of their environment, and they're establishing tripwires. So if anybody actually falls onto these services, whether it's something like a web server, a Samba server, or an FTP server, you have a bunch of different Open Canary scripts to emulate different services. They're easy to stand up. They're easy to put out. You can set that up, and if anybody trips on those, well, then you know that something interesting is happening on your organization. And some organizations are going so far as tools like Canary or Open Canary on the open source side, implementing those, and they're fundamentally altering their entire network topology as soon as a workstation starts integrating with these different artifacts. So if somebody implements with an Open Canary service, let's just say a SMB server, and you can immediately then shun them off to a VLAN that looks like they're still on the production VLAN, but they're now into kind of this weird house of horrors where the attacker isn't accessing real data. They're pulling down all kinds of strange data that isn't directly related to the organization, trying to keep that attacker more integrated as well. And then the alerting is awesome. Open Canary has a wide variety of different alerting options, all the way down to getting Gmail alerts. So be checking for Active Defense Harbinger distribution. I think Ben's already got this implemented into ADHD. And ADHD is, when we're looking at active defense, is a type of threat intelligence. It's not necessarily threat intelligence feeds from other attacks, but it's threat intelligence of what threat actors are doing against your organization right now, which is pretty cool, which could be part of your overall threat intelligence program. Blacklists. On the next slide, I have a whole bunch of blacklists that are out there. By far, this is the easiest threat intel step. Going online, pulling down some blacklists, right? And then simply implementing the blacklist on the perimeter or checking to see if there's actually a hit and logs. And this can be used for like IP addresses, URLs, SSL certs. But its value can be limited, especially whenever you're talking about open source blacklists. And eventually those blacklists get really good about attacks, but it isn't nearly as up to date on some of the cutting edge attacks that you would get from a commercial threat intelligence feed. But even they have some problems, and I'll talk more about that here in just a second. Here's a couple of blacklists that you guys can look at. There's a whole bunch of them out there. Everyone has their favorites. But the ones that we tend to use again and again and again will be malware domain list, or malware domains, OpenFish, Fish Tank, IP void, URL void, and another one that is oftentimes overlooked is SSL blacklists. What SSL certs are being used by attackers today that you can actually start fingerprinting and identifying in your web proxy logs, and then trying to identify if any of those SSL certificates are being used against your users today. Here's a fun blacklist trick, all right? So we've been talking about this for a while, and I got to try to come up with a webcast and actually create like a lab around it we can all do together. But one of the things you can do is you can use current lists, whether it's a commercial list or whether or not it is an old list. It really doesn't matter. But you pull down a current list and you compare it with old data, all right? And this is magical. Let me explain why. So if you're a bad guy, right, and you're attacking a network, you're going to be jumping IP addresses and domains fairly quickly. The reason why you're doing that is you want to make sure that your domain and your IP address doesn't show up on a blacklist, and then magically the good guys can start detecting you and shut down your C2 channel. So you're going to try to rotate your IP addresses and your URLs. You're going to try to rotate these things around very quickly to stay ahead of that standing wave of blacklists, be it commercial blacklists or open blacklists, detecting a domain or an IP address that you're using or an ASN that you're using, and then people starting to shun you. So it's this constant movement game, kind of like Frogger, the video game where you're jumping across the street. Now what you can do is you pull an archive of your connection data or your URL data or your DNS data, and you sit on it for like 2 weeks or a month. Then you compare that connection list with a really, really new cutting-edge commercial threat intelligence feed or a blacklist that you pull down offline, and then magic happens because while the bad guy is very good at jumping ahead of current lists, eventually the IP addresses, ASNs, and domains that these bad guys use are going to end up on these lists, whether it's a commercial list or whether or not it is an open source list. You can actually pull that down, sit on the data for a little while, and then do a current up-to-date list with older connection data. So it's very, very, very good for finding those bad guys that are moving around. Now that does mean you're going to have systems that have been compromised for a longer period of time on the inside of your environment, but that's also a sign of a more advanced attacker and their approaches with it. A great archive, HS Latman, has a really, really, really cool collection of threat intelligence feeds and websites and different formats and all kinds of things, kind of tying that all together. So a huge, my hat's off to him for the great work that he does. So let's kind of go through a couple of quick conclusions because I want to get to Jason and they can talk about Threat Connect. The first thing is more information is better than less, right? Sometimes, most of the time, I mean, it can be bad, right? And that is something that I think is important. The community itself doesn't do really well talking with itself, right? Sharing intelligence information about different types of attacks. And that's one of the big things about any type of threat intelligence feed that you get into. Don't be a welcher. Don't be an organization that takes threat intelligence feeds but never gives back to the threat intelligence feeds, whether it be open source threat intelligence feeds, commercial open threat intelligence feeds. You have to feed back into the ecosystem. Also, that more information is good. That information can be used to propel you forward in your security architecture, to make you strive to do better, to make you understand what it is you are doing that is maybe deficient. What are other organizations doing that is more advanced? Learning from other people's mistakes and then trying to make sure that our architecture can handle those different mistakes moving forward. Because ultimately, a lot of attacks follow the exact same types of patterns. If we see these same patterns again and again and again, then maybe we can start developing architectures that are more resilient to these attack patterns and post-exploitation patterns. And that data that you get from threat intelligence feeds can be useful to that end. But let's talk about that data, right? Data is, I hate to say this, but data in and of itself is almost useless. It's just a whole bunch of information. And unfortunately, this is where a large amount of threat intelligence feeds reside today. They're just dumping data and maybe a little bit of information. It's structured, organized data. But it really doesn't help you build knowledge, and it really doesn't help you build intelligence or wisdom. And that is something that is sorely missing from many of these products. How do you actually tie this together with your own organization? How do you tie together multiple different data feeds to try to find correlations and patterns with multiple different threat intelligence feeds and visualize it in such a way that you can actually take action with it, right? Actually moving forward with knowledge, moving forward up to the point of wisdom or intelligence. And this is one of those things that we're constantly working at in offensive countermeasures. If we have a large amount of data, how can we actually pull that data down, visualize that data so it becomes something that can become knowledge eventually, right? Contextualized, synthesized data, right? That we can use that for learning and then actually make better decisions in our organizations. And that, we're kind of transitioning into Threat Connect and Jason kind of taking over, and I think that that's what's really cool. One of the things that's fundamentally different about what Threat Connect does is they have the ability of actually tying together what you have in your organization, multiple different threat intelligence feeds, and allowing you to actually learn from the data and having a human interaction to actually implement and start acting on some of this intelligence that you're actually pulling down online. And that's something that is sorely missing. Yeah, you can do it yourself. There's always people in Security Weekly like, yeah, I can do that myself with Python and maybe Angular 2 and some Node, and I'll get that done. That's great. If you're one of those people that can do that, by all means, please go forth, do that. That's great. But for the vast majority of us, we don't have that much time to do these things. Now, here's where this becomes an even bigger nightmare. Whenever you're looking at threat intelligence feeds and you actually pull down IOCs and you're pulling down data, the number of formats is really more than just a little bit unnerving, right? And many times once you choose a format, you've kind of locked yourself into a handful of different threat intelligence feeds. And this is where a tremendous amount of work goes into, especially with commercial products. As I say a lot of times, there's not a lot of commercial products I say that you need to buy, right? We'll say Burp is one of them. Absolutely, Burp Suite Pro is fantastic, and it's cheaper than a lot of the other commercial web application scanners. Maltego would be in that category. And Paul's here, I'm going to make him blush. Nessus, I think, is the best vulnerability assessment scanning engine on the market, especially for the price. But if you're trying to start pulling across multiple different threat intelligence feeds, and you're trying to do it on your own, it becomes a very, very difficult task. You need a massive team. So when you're trying to pull these threat intelligence feeds, correlate them, and try to tie that all together, it's not one of those things where it's just a couple of hours of Python, you can do it on your own. It's actually far more difficult than that. And that's where something like Threat Connect can actually come in and play with that very, very well. So as I said, this is an odd vendor story, right? So whenever nobody, I'm assuming, that's on this webcast is really all that in the dark about what my feelings and my thoughts are on threat intelligence feeds, right? I've spent a lot of time talking about how threat intelligence feeds can be, by and large, a tremendous waste of time. They can be a huge time sink. People aren't implementing them correct. And then all of a sudden, Paul gets this phone call from Threat Connect, and they're like, yeah, we'd like to sponsor the show. And Paul's like, you do know that one of the members of our webcast is constantly ripping on threat intelligence feeds. And it was odd, Jason, I don't know if you know this, but Threat Connect was like, yeah, we know, and actually we agree a lot with what John's saying. And that's kind of where I'm going to hand this off to Jason, but I want you all to understand that we're kind of in the vendor area now at the end, but it's important to understand that there's a difference between a threat intelligence feed and a platform that allows you to start using that threat intelligence feed usefully in your organization. And that's one of the reasons why I'm okay getting on a webcast with Threat Connect, because they aren't just a magical feed of magical unicorn droppings, also known as Skittles, that are going to make your network completely secure. If you look at it, it's a platform that's trying to tie things together to give you better intelligence so that you can make better decisions. And that's one of the reasons why I'm okay doing this, and that's one of the reasons why we were shocked, but then we were pleasantly surprised by what Threat Connect actually brought to the table. So I'd like to give Jason a few moments to kind of talk about their product and kind of let us know what they're doing that is pretty much different from what a lot of different vendors in this space are doing. So Jason, I'll hand it over to you, sir. You now have the con.
Thank you so much, John Paul. Again, really appreciate the opportunity for letting me speak with you. So I'm really glad, actually, that you mentioned the whole blacklist trick, and also, frankly, the whole trend of people who are in the industry just complaining about threat intel feeds. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people complain about IOCs and complain about what that means as far as actual intelligence is concerned. And frankly, like I kind of look at the idea of threat data feeds. There are what you call threat intel feeds as essentially threat data feeds, because there's not much intelligence in there. There's not much information that is currently relevant that can help you and assist you to carry out the job of securing whatever you're there to secure. So that being said, it's been interesting, I must say, over the course of the last 7 years that I've been in the industry, to see this kind of progression towards, oh, look how many IOCs I have on the spreadsheet. I've got a golden copy. I've got a huge database that is somehow valuable in protecting the organization that I'm hired to protect. And that's one of the reasons why I was attracted to Threat Connect, is because what Threat Connect attempts to do is connect as many sources and points of data as it possibly can, so that people can actually use it as a threat intelligence platform that essentially helps you identify, manage, and block threats faster. Whatever interest or organization you're working for. So that's really what attracted me to Threat Connect. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes,
Okay,
I
good.
can see it.
Okay, awesome. So speaking of threat data feeds and supposed threat intel feeds, I'm going to kick off this mini demo, and I'm not going to get too technical. For those of you who are listening, we do have tutorials online that you guys can access and learn more in-depth ways of using Threat Connect. But for the purposes of the next 5 to 10 minutes, I'm just going to go over some of the core functionalities of Threat Connect that really make it stand out, in my opinion, as far as the power of giving users and organizations who have a certain amount of employees or a certain amount of tools that they're using and integrating it with, and how it really does help make sense of this massive amount of data that is only growing larger by the day. So what we're looking at here is just the dashboard. And basically what the dashboard offers users is just aggregated information about stuff that's been happening currently within the organization. This is the demo copy, of course, so this stuff isn't as up to date as an active user would use or would see in the dashboard. And so it gives analysts as well as management just kind of a rundown of what the teams are working on. The statuses of them, and allows tasking. This is very just basic general stuff, but has its importance as far as the day-to-day and hour-to-hour operations of a threat detection response team in your average organization. So yeah, it just also offers an aggregation of all of the real-time ongoing data points about all of the things that the client might be interested in looking at, just kind of on a day-to-day basis or an hour-to-hour basis. And again, speaking of threat data feeds, one of the things that really struck me about Threat Connect when I first learned about them is that you can put in as many sources and feeds as you want. We could go all the way down the line. Obviously, there's plenty of them, but they also offer membership in communities. And so basically what that means is that Threat Connect gives people, individuals and organizations of any size, the ability to not only join communities that also exist, but also create communities. And they can customize those communities. And it basically allows teams from, say I'm a bank, oh, you're a bank. Well, we're both getting pwned by the same attacks, by the same TTPs, by the same vectors. So why don't we just share information? I mean, 7 years ago, that wasn't really the case. People were so, as you started off the podcast saying, is that there was a lot of fear out there. And as the data mounted, the fear kind of increased, and people really it seemed that organizations would choose to hold that threat data close to their chest. Well, it turns out that's actually probably a pretty bad idea. So one of the aspects of Threat Connect, as far as data feeds or sources, is that they offer communities that can connect and share threat data in real time, and I think that's a pretty powerful feature of Threat Connect. So moving right along, if you click on the Browse tab, you're offered a running real-time, very convenient one-screen place where you can access, at the click of a button, whatever you want to be looking for at that moment in time. You can also manage what sources you're looking at. You can pare it all down, which allows pivoting or comparison that much more effective. So the browse screen is really great. So what I'd like to do now is just go over a couple of features that really illustrate for me how Threat Connect has some simple solutions built in that really can give analysts who are boots on the ground employees in these threat intel teams a way to access information and cross-reference relevant threat intelligence that has been shared and developed by others almost instantaneously. So rather than going out and hunting in the wild and being like, oh, let me just scour the open source to see what I can find, and maybe it'll take me a few hours, maybe like a day or two, they have the ability to go into Threat Connect and query the massive database that's growing every day. And that's a pretty powerful thing in my experience. So what I'd like to start off with showing you guys is the Analyze feature. It's just simple, just one click, you click on it. You have the text field. And so let's say I'm an analyst and I'm monitoring my SIM and an alert fires, I'm sorry. And you're like, oh, what's this? I've never seen this domain before. I don't know anything about it. Well, rather than going out to the open source and spending time and effort trying to figure out what this might be, I'm just going to throw it into the Threat Connect Analyze feature. And another cool thing about the Analyze feature that makes it really helpful is, say you're looking at like a malware feed list, and you look at it on a daily basis, and every day it spits out like 150 domains or IPs or any other IOC. You can just copy and paste the entire page, throw the entire text into this field, and Threat Connect will just parse it all out. So it's just really easy drag and drop functionality. But for our purposes, we'll just keep it simple today and say again, I'm an analyst, in the threat detection room, skiff or whatever you want to call it, and I get an alert and I see this domain that was really suspicious that an employee clicked on, and I'm like, oh, well, what's this? Well, before I go scouring the internet, let me see what Threat Connect knows. Maybe someone out there has seen something like that. So, oh, huh. Well, the domain ninthclub.com seems to have attracted some kind of attention in the past. Let me see. It's been in the common community. Oh, well, what's the default description? Okay, well, now I know it's a Vautrac Banking Trojan C2 host, or at least it has been in the past. The reason why it's probably rated 1% is because it's probably been knocked out of commission. But anyhow, okay, well, now I know that, within the course of, 5 seconds. Let's click on the attributes. All right, here's some more additional analysis and context from various sources that have probably been posted by multiple users across many communities.
Hey, Jason?
Yeah?
I had a quick question here from Rick. He said, any specific communities related to the financial sector, like FSISec, and could this be a viable replacement for like Soletra Edge, as support costs for that product make it very difficult for an average-sized company to use?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, one of the limitations of giving demos in this kind of context is that we can't share all of the communities publicly. But yes, we do have relationships with many organizations like that, and I would absolutely say that that is the case. And it's not just limited to the financial services-esque communities. We also deal with pharmaceuticals, natural oil and natural gas, medical services, many different communities. And also, customers have the opportunities, if they so choose, to form their own private communities within those communities as well. So that's also another kind of cool part about Threat Connect. But I'm glad you asked that question. So yeah, moving on. So an analyst can just keep clicking down and see what else everyone out there who is just as interested in this information as the user who is querying this is. And it doesn't hit every time, but when it does, it's sweet and it's quick, and it allows the user to at least have the fighting chance to get out in front of threats that might be attacking them. And I see we're running out of time, but I'd like to close with what is possibly one of my most favorite features within Threat Connect, and I've seen some pretty awesome wins using this feature as well. And that's the tracking feature. So just to give you a little bit of background, what that means is if an analyst is, looking at an IOC, for example, and let's call it like a domain, and they do a whois lookup, any of the, well, not any, but many data points in the whois information can be used then to track the registrant, even if it was spoofed, to see what other activity they've had as far as registering websites are concerned. And this is actually a really useful tool, not only in figuring out, like if you can identify a threat that you are pretty sure at least that it has been threatening you, and you can figure out like some infrastructure from their whois information, whether it's a registrant name, whether it's a fax number, whether it's a phone number, whether it's a name server, whether it's a registrant email address. You can take that piece of information and throw it into Threat Connect, and you can see all of the other domains that they've created, which then might give you some kind of an idea of not only the activity that they've had in the past, but then you can continue tracking them in the future to see if they're creating any new infrastructure that you might be able to spot, maybe plug into your SIM to make signatures and create alerts that better protect you against threats from people who you've known that have already attacked you, even if the registrant name might be completely spoofed. So I'm just going to give a really quick and dirty example of the tracking feature so I can show you what that means. So let's say I'm an analyst in a SOC, and I'm just monitoring network traffic, and an employee has visited an extremely suspicious site. But I don't know. Before I throw it into Threat Connect and just say it's a malicious domain, let me just go and see if I can find out any information on this thing. So I mean, look at this website. Would you guys say that's kind of suspicious? So
Can you go back to it real quick? I was answering a question.
oh, sorry. Well, I'm looking at the whois record right now of this domain right here. Top.
Dude, that's totally legit. My kids play that game all the time.
Who knows what language that's in? No, but seriously. So the analyst is looking at it, and let's say it's November the 12th, and they're like, what the what? This was created on the 11th? Yesterday? Yeah, it's probably suspicious. Okay, well, let me see what other registered information I can find out about this guy. Okay, well let's start with the email. Okay, Miroshenko at yandex.ru. Well, maybe he's a legit guy. Maybe he, this is a spoof. Who knows? I hate the domain tools. Doesn't allow you to copy. Maybe this is a legit guy. Well, let's throw a track in on this registrant information. So what we're going to go ahead and do is track. We'll just give it a name. Sorry, bear with me. I can't copy and paste that. So we're going to throw this whois information in here. And again, it can be a phone number, it can be a registered fax number, it can be a street address. And we're going to see what other activity the person who's claimed this registered information has done in the past. Because we're pretty sure that this website that this identity has created with is pretty bad. So, but before we save it, we're going to test just to see, because sometimes tracks return no results. Okay, that's not right. There we go. So maybe I spelled it wrong. I probably spelled it wrong. Miroshenko. Let's try this one more time. Hopefully this will work. Yeah, see, it turns out that this identity has been used to register 314 results. So let's go just take a look at, what other domains this guy has come up with. So, we have the criteria right here that we initially signed it up with. But, we'll put a description, found this registrant, signing up like a domain that we found to be suspicious. So you can, keep track of the context. Then you click on the results and, okay, this guy's up to no good. This is definitely information that we want to push to our SIM. Make sure we have alerts and signatures on it to make sure that if this individual or group, attacks us in the future, that we're at least protected in real time. And of course, you can also, set up, you can follow and get results, whether it's immediate or summary. And this is just another one of my favorite features in Threat Connect that allow threat intelligence teams or threat detection teams to turn IOCs and their associated information into actual threat intelligence that is relevant for protecting organizations and getting ahead of threat actors. So I'll end the demo here, but I encourage all of you guys to sign up for a free account and check out our YouTube page for much more detailed demos of the product. But I just want to close by thanking with you guys for having me on, and just really excited about how Threat Connect is really bringing together all of the forces that have been, frankly, from what I've seen, been building over the last 7 years, as far as moving forward with protecting as much as we can against malicious actors.
Very
Thanks
cool.
so much, Jason. That was cool stuff. John, I just want to remind people that there are webcasts that we're working on getting scheduled for December 1st and December 15th. Likely the next ones will be sponsored by Endgame. We'll be doing another one, and Pony Express has some interesting stuff coming up, so make sure you stay tuned.
Paul, I do have some information about the next one. I think it's sponsored by Pony Express, I'm not sure, but we will be having a webcast where we go end-to-end with the Exchange vulnerabilities that BHIS has come out with, mainly in response to Microsoft and Exchange experts saying it's worrying about. However, if anybody here has Outlook web access, they're going to want to watch it because it absolutely is something you should be worried about. So be on the lookout for that. That'll be coming out here shortly.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone, for attending. We'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks, everyone.